Okay, here we are, lecture three of the Progressive Era, where I'm going to talk about feminism and the 19th Amendment, but also about the different progressive presidents and how the sort of high politics of the period played out. Feminism first became a widely used word in the Progressive Era. Inspired by the writings of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the Feminist Alliance, which was a small organization of New York professional women, developed plans to aid women in their community by building apartment houses that had communal kitchens, had communal cafeterias, had daycare centers. The idea was to free women from the constraints of home and domestic work. But they ran into problems. The women the Feminist Alliance weren't able to obtain a mortgage to either buy buildings or build new buildings. So that never happened at all, although it was a very popular attempt at the time. In 1914, a mass meeting in New York debated the question, what is feminism? So, by the way, anyone who tells you that feminism is a new word it's not true. It's at least 100 years old. And that was a very well attended debate it was organized by a group named Heterodoxy, which is a women's club in Greenwich Village. And basically, this feminism, progressive era feminism, which is sometimes called new feminism, but it's difficult to call it new feminism because that is often used for 1970s feminism. But this feminism's attack on traditional gender norms and sexual behavior added a new dimension to the ideas of personal freedom that I've been talking about in this series of lectures. Heterodoxy was part of a new radical, quote, bohemia, unquote, end quote. And bohemia is an interesting word. It's named after a region in Austria. And what it is, it's a circle of artists, writers, and others who, sort of reject conventional rules and practices, and bohemian things and bohemian ways of life were sort of very popular, were kind of like the cutting edge of social activity for young people and for intellectuals and things like that. And they had a definition of feminism that merged calls for the vote and greater economic opportunity with relatively open discussions of sexuality. Okay, this is the new thing in this new feminism. In Greenwich Village and similar neighborhoods in Chicago and San Francisco and other cities, something called the lyrical left took shape. That it was included discussion groups, experimental theaters, magazines, and it anticipated the emancipation of the human spirit from 19th century prejudices. Okay, all this was taking place before World War I. And another aspect of this, a way in which this was sort of symbolized and projected, was Isadora Duncan's new way of expressive dance. Her new art of expressive dance, which I'm going to show in a minute, was one symbol of that era. And women's growing presence in the labor market strengthened demands for birth control, which would, giving political expression to changes in sexual behavior. In the 19th century, the right to control one's body meant the ability to refuse sexual advances, including those of a husband. But now, in the progressive period, it meant enjoying an active social life. Yes, it did mean enjoying an active social life. What I meant to say was an active sexual life without necessarily bearing children. Emma Goldman, an anarchist, a Lithuanian immigrant, regularly wrote and lectured about the right to birth control and called for a more enlightened view of homosexuality. And for both these things, she was arrested quite frequently. Margaret Sanger, another leader in the birth control movement, placed birth control at the center of the new feminism. Okay, By 1914, she was facing censorship from the U.S. Post Office for writing about how to use birth control, but she openly advertised birth control devices in her journal called The Women's Rebel. Sanger argued that no woman could be free who did not control her own body and who did not control decisions about whether to become a mother. Now, in 1916, when Sanger opened a clinic in a birth control clinic in working class area of Brooklyn, and started giving contraceptive devices to poor Jewish and Italian women, she was jailed for a month. Okay. But on the other hand, but the birth control movement was wider than just Sanger. Labor radicals, cultural modernists, not just Sanger and feminists, promoted birth control. But Sanger's difficulties with this illustrated the ways in which local authorities and national obscenity legislation, which is another serious problem, set rigid limits to Americans' expressions of freedom at the time. Now, this cartoon from, again, Puck, which is a magazine we talked about a lot in this course so far. The title of this cartoon is called Divorce, the Lesser Evil. On the left, you have a quarreling husband and wife, and they're chained to a happy marriage, right? And Justice, the woman with the sword and the cape and everything, and the liberty cap, is about to sever the marriage with her sword, while a minister, a churchman, tries to prevent her. Okay. Now, divorce laws had been liberalized after the Civil War. By the 1890s, the U.S. had the highest divorce rate in the Western world. But in this caption here, the church declared divorce on sorry, I'm not saying this right. In the caption, the church declares divorce an awful immorality, to which Justice replies, Justice, the woman in the wielding the sword, divorce is rather an aid to morality. Okay, that's a very important distinction. Here's a piece of sheet music that is from this period. And you can see it's it has a woman. The only thing I ask of you, and she's rubbing out erasing the word obey from the marriage vows. So this was a popular song of the time, especially among feminists. And here's a picture of Isadora Duncan, who really brought freedom, especially a new freedom of movement that seemed very, very wild and radical to dance, but it was also wildly popular. Okay. And by the way, the YouTube videos of Isadora Duncan actually dancing aren't very good. The resolution is poor. There weren't very many in the first place, but at least there's something to see if you want to go look them up in YouTube. And this is Emma Goldman giving a speech. Okay, much beloved Emma Goldman, much feared Emma Goldman, here speaking in favor of birth control to. By the way, the crowd is almost all men in New York in 1916. There's another a poster advertising a series of Emma Goldman lectures, and showing if you can read it. Again, the resolution may not be all that great, but it shows that she can talk on a variety of topics. Right? So Emma Goldman is really very, very, very interesting, very vigorous campaigner for certain rights, but also very controversial about her methods. So she's one of these people in history that's whose personality and work combined to make her so appealing to study. Now, here's an interesting picture. This is mothers with baby carriages, but the mothers with baby carriages are outside Margaret Sanger's birth control clinic in Brownsville in Brooklyn in 1916. Okay, so these are mothers with baby carriages going to get birth control to prevent them from having another pregnancy. Now, I haven't talked much about progressivism being a worldwide movement, but in the early 20th century, cities around the world experienced similar problems caused by industrialization and massive growth. Okay, you see, in 1850, only two cities, London and Paris, had populations of more than a million. By 1900, there were 12 in Europe and the United States. In the United States, those were New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. And reformers around the world, they exchanged ideas, they proposed new social policies, and Britain, France, and Germany created old age pensions, minimum wage laws, unemployment insurance that regulated workplace safety. And American reformers started to advocate for similar types of social legislation, which meant government action to address urban problems and the insecurities of working class life. You see, progressives thought modern society required basic changes in the functions of political authority. Now, this is whether to check the power of corporations to protect consumers, to civilize market relations, or to guarantee industrial freedom in the workplace. Okay, they were influenced by Gilded Age and European reforms. American progressives thought that the United States was always lagging behind Europe in these regards. Progressives, they sought to renew notions of an activist, socially conscious government, and they rejected old assumptions that powerful government threatened liberty. They saw freedom as a positive, not a negative concept, and active government as a positive, not a negative force. Perhaps the most prominent of this school of this type of progressive thought was a man named John Dewey, who didn't invent, but was perhaps the biggest proponent of a school of philosophy called pragmatism. And pragmatism insisted that institutions and social policies must be judged by their concrete efforts, not tradition, not their longevity, or how well they fit in with religious doctrine or traditional political belief. All institutions and social practice should be put up to the test of whether they work. Okay? Experience, pragmatists insisted, was more important than doctrine. Now, some saw pragmatism as a way of using evidence to moderate conflicts between religion and science. For others, the outlook encouraged an experimental approach to social problems. And this was very characteristic of progressivism, trying new social policies, trying new social practices to see if they work. Okay, the idea was that with the right information and the right application of the right information, social improvement could be achieved, and that this is an idea widely shared by American progressives as well as progressives in other countries. Okay, now you see, it was always slightly more. In a way, slightly more difficult in the United States because the United States is a decentralized federal system of government, which means that power is dispersed to the states. So big sweeping national change was a lot easier to do in more centralized countries like Britain, France, and Germany. On the other hand, some aspects of the American way of governing were beneficial to progressivism because certain state legislatures, for instance, and governors, for instance, like Robert La Follette, who we'll talk more about later in the class, could implement progressive reforms on their state level and try them out. So whenever you don't hear this so much anymore, but 10, 15 years ago, when there were a lot of debates about different types of things, especially in education, you'd often hear politicians say, well, that's left to the states because we want the states to be the laboratories where they try out different things. And things that work, other states will adopt, and things that don't work, the states will abandon. Now, whether this actually happens is a very, very good question, but that's beyond the scope of this class. Okay, and don't forget, also in cities, progressives work to reform the structure of government, to reduce the power of political bosses, to establish public control of natural monopolies like gas and waterworks and water supply, improve public transportation. Progressive mayors, again, were able to enact things. Mayors and city councils were able to enact things that weren't able to enact on a national level. They often had to raise property taxes to do it, but that was spent on more on schools, on parks, other public facilities. Lots of very famous things that we take for granted in the United States, Central Park, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, are all progressive era innovations. There were Gilded Age mayors, lots of Gilded Age mayors lots of Gilded Age mayors had tried this urban progressivism, but it hadn't really worked. It needed a lot more support among the population, and that came later as populism began to become more popular in cities in the early 20th century. Okay, so it's one thing to have an idea about progressivism in the Gilded Age, but it didn't really take off until the rest of your city or state agreed with it. Okay, this is a photograph from 1910 that depicts needy constituents of the political boss Timothy Big Tim Sullivan. Okay, these people are getting free pairs of shoes. Each year, Sullivan gave out 2,000 pairs of shoes on his mother's birthday. Okay, and this was the idea was that by doing this, it would endear you. Your constituents would be endeared to you, right? Many voters would like you because you were giving out things. You seemed like you were, a kindly and benevolent uncle, and that worked for an awful lot of political bosses. And of course, unfortunately, one of the problems with that is it can be corrupted very easily and can turn into patronage jobs and liquor licenses and everything else can be given out in unofficial and sort of corrupt and underhand ways. Now, again, another aspect of this period is the library movement. Remember how I talked about Andrew Carnegie building libraries? Well, that took a while, right? And but they finally started to take root in the early 20th century. And it wasn't just Andrew Carnegie; it was a lot of people. A lot of cities built their own libraries. A lot of other philanthropic groups funded libraries. This is boys and girls waiting to enter the branch of the New York Public Library in 1910. Okay, now the interesting thing, you can't see it here because it wasn't in the original photograph. I mean, it's not in the photograph I have. There was a caption that read, "The children's room is already full, 3:30 p.m." This is the idea was that, or the message they're trying to send out here is that kids are so eager for education they run straight from school to the library. Okay, and now don't forget, one of the reasons libraries are so popular and because so popular with progressives is that people hope that they would help uplift and assimilate new immigrants and their children. Okay, so very often the only time lots of children heard English was at school and at places like the library. Okay? They spoke their parents' language at home. If you wanted to say that progressivism was a philosophy of activist government, you wouldn't be wrong, right? Progressives definitely believe that to be the best solution to the problem because only government is big enough to put through these changes. But it may be best perhaps expressed by women reformers was the idea that activist government had to be much more democratic. Okay? More people had to be participating in government. More people had to be voting, women obviously, and other people, in order to have progressive government actually work. You can't have a progressive government when it's only representing a very, very small group of voters because only the needs and the desires of those voters will be attended to. Okay. Now, again, women are central to this progressive politics, even though they were still unable to vote and hold office in most states. They challenged barriers to political participation. They elaborated a democratic grassroots vision of government, and they were moved to act most often by the conditions faced by poor immigrant communities and women and child workers. The era's most prominent female reformer was Jane Addams. Adams never married, and she resisted the expectations to become tied to a family as a mother or wife or an aunt who took care of, as sort of a governess, right? And what she did instead was in 1899, she founded Hull House in Chicago, which was called a settlement house. The idea was that it was there to improve the lives of the immigrant poor. Now, the settlement house workers moved into poor neighborhoods. They built and ran schools, they ran employment bureaus, health clinics, places of refuge, shelters for abused women, things like that. And by 1910, more than 400 settlement houses had been established in cities around the nation. That's a huge number. In a lot of cities, one settlement house would have been able to handle almost all the major problems of that urban area. So the fact that there were 400 shows you that the reach was very great. And Adams, you see, typified the progressive era as new woman. Again, I remember I mentioned new feminism earlier, new woman. Increasing numbers of women were going to college, were entering the professions, and for most women, the professions were social services, nursing, education. And a lot of these people were middle-class women. Their efforts to help the poor, to help working women, to help children help expand government's role in society. So through the settlement movement, through other social work, these women learned that legislation was necessary to deal with housing, to deal with income and health inequalities. Okay, you couldn't just do this as a charity enterprise. You could do it as a charity enterprise up to a certain point, but eventually governments need to step in order to deal with problems persistent by unscrupulous landlords and things like that. Okay, so what the Hull House movement did is it led to a number of campaigns for other types of legislation. Now this, of course, first happens in Illinois, happens in Chicago, and these included shorter working hours, workplace safety, union organizing rights, and they tried to inspire other settlement house movements and programs in other cities to do the same thing. Okay. Now, the big difference, of course, which is always the big difference in the country, is that in the South, race affected reform. Okay. Ending child labor was justified as necessary because it gave white children the education they would need as members of the South's ruling race. So you see, in the South, there also is this racial element to progressivism that seems to us and even to people at the time is very prejudiced. Okay, we can't have white children working in factories. We need them in schools because they need to be educated because they're the ones who are going to become political leaders in the society in Southern society. So don't get the idea that progressivism is everywhere. A good thing. There were racist progressivists. There were eugenicists who were progressives. So location mattered. Location mattered quite a lot. So that we always have to keep in mind that these things usually were very diverse and very difficult. Okay. Now, here we have a picture of a visiting nurse on a New York City rooftop. Okay, 1908. Okay, this is a visiting nurse would often go to the top of New York tenements and check to make sure that there was proper airflow in houses and proper airflow in tenement buildings, because that was considered one of the most important things about health improvement and sanitary conditions in the city. So you would often see visiting nurses roaming across the rooftops of tenement buildings, and it must have looked very odd at the time until you realize that's of course what they were doing. Now, here's an interesting example. This is Mayor Mary Howard, right? She was in the center there. She was the mayor of the town of Kanab, K-A-N-A-B, or Kanab, I can't remember, Utah. Okay, and notice also that the whole town council, by the way, this is the mayor and the whole town council, They served from 1912 to 1914, the first all-female municipal government in American history. Now, Kanab, Utah is not a big place, but the fact that this happened shows that progressive women were having an effect on the voting population in certain places. Right, they could get elected to office because lots of people were beginning to believe they had the right ideas and they were the right people to do it. They were kind of the mothers, the caretakers of the city. Okay, now, obviously, you've been waiting for this for a while. I need to talk about suffrage. Women's suffrage is perhaps the most important issue of the late 19th century, early 20th century. But before you get the idea that it sort of erupts on the scene as part of the progressive movement in 1900, don't forget calls for the vote by women's organizations, calls for the vote by people who were trying to help women had been around for at least 50 years, more than 50 years. I think the first women's organized conference to get the vote was in 1830 in Massachusetts. So this is not some brand new thing that springs up because of the progressive era. But after 1900, the campaign for women's suffrage became a mass movement for the first time. The National American Women's Suffrage Association had a membership that grew from 13,000 in 1893 to more than 2 million by 1917. And its campaigns were successful in some states. Okay, half of the states in the country allowed women to vote in local elections, were regarding schools, school board elections especially. And suffrage was granted political suffrage was granted in places like Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, Utah, western states. That they led the way in women not only voting but holding public office. And by the way, this all happens in the late 1800s. Wyoming allows women. Wyoming is still a territory in 1870, but grants women the right to vote in 1870. And then when it becomes a state, very quickly thereafter, women are actually voting in presidential elections even. So that's an interesting story in itself, largely the result of wanting to attract more settlers to the states. So if you offer things like female suffrage, it's going to seem like a more attractive place to go. And then after the turn of the century, well, between 1910 anyway and 1914, 7 more Western states gave women the vote. Okay. Now, what happens is the suffrage movements in the new 20th century were conducted with a greater spirit of militancy, and they used modern forms of advertising, of publicity, entertainment that were characteristic of the mass consumer society. As I keep saying throughout this course, people are paying attention to what's going on. Right? And when they realize that selling suffrage the same way or in similar ways you sell soap can be very effective, that's what they do. Okay. Now, again, you run into this problem in different states doing different things, different suffrage associations within different states doing different things. And so it became obvious that, again, groups like the National American Women's Suffrage Association really needed to take over the suffrage movement because state efforts could only go so far. So there needed to be a national push, right? And we'll get to, of course, when women win the vote, when we talk about that in subsequent sessions. But it's very, very important changes, very, very important changes. Now, the celebration of women's domestic role actually inspired aspects of the suffrage movement too. Okay, some people think that it takes people out of the role of wife and mother, but the progressive movement sort of linked the two very strongly. Lots of progressive proposals emerged from the idea that female reformers could improve the lives of poor mothers and poor children, and that could be protected by the states. Okay, some states enacted pensions for mothers to enable them to care for their children. These were maternalist reforms, and they were based on the assumption that government should encourage women's ability to bear children and raise them and allow them to become economically independent. Okay. Other progressive legislation argued that women recognized that women worked outside the home, but defined them as a dependent group like children that needed state protection in the ways male workers did not. See, often most unions were male only. Okay. Now, so in a landmark case, Mueller versus Oregon in 1908, the U.S. Supreme Court accepted the arguments of Louis Brandeis, who we mentioned last time, that long hours of labor were dangerous for women, okay, because this affected their childbearing activities, and long hours needed to be regulated. Hours needed to be regulated by government intervention. So this was the first major breach of the liberty of contract document. The liberty of contract doctrine, for the government to stand in and say women's hours have to be regulated because they have this special role in society. Okay, so the use of government to regulate working conditions really raised a lot of questions about, again, the liberty of contract, and also these maternalist policies built gender inequality into the early foundations of the welfare state. Okay, there were lots of mothers' laws, there were lots of mothers and children's laws based on their gender and their traditional gender roles. There were not as many fathers' laws. Paternal leave, for instance, would have been considered nuts to try to pass at this stage. Okay, but still, some progressives like Louis Brandeis thought a welfare state that was rooted in the notion of universal economic entitlements, including the right to a decent income, protection against unemployment and work-related accidents, that was the key to progressivism. And that sort of vision really enjoyed considerable support in the progressive era. Okay. And by 1913, 22 states had enacted workmen's compensation laws to benefit both male and female workers. This legislation really propped the door open for broader programs eventually in the New Deal period that helped to create social insurance. This is a good suffragist photograph. I like it. This is Inez Milholland, who was a leading suffragette in the early part of the 20th century. And what she's doing here is she's on a horse, sort of evoking the image of Joan of Arc, right? But most importantly, I think for this, she's on a white horse wearing a white cape, okay? And if white was the symbol that the suffragists used in the United States anyway, as one of their images white was the color they used as a symbol as an image for their movement. So white banners, white sashes, things like that. You may remember a few states of the Union ago when a number of female Congress representatives and senators all wore white to one of the states of the Union, I think under the Trump administration, and they wore suffrage garb, and because it was celebrating in 2019 the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. So white is a very important symbol, and it was used constantly by suffragists. This, going back to my favorite subject, is movies. This is Mary Pickford, right, who was one of the most important movie stars at the time, but she also supported women's suffrage, and this shows her reading a women's suffrage magazine and a newspaper, I should say, and wearing suffrage white. Okay, this is from around 1910. And so we had some women who were very prominent, wealthy women, very prominent elites. This is Louisine Havemeyer, one of New York's wealthiest women, who was a strong advocate of women's suffrage. She's passing a Torch of Liberty to New Jersey women, New Jersey suffragists. This is two boats passing in the harbor. This is again a photograph from 1915. So you see that suffrage white that she's wearing, and that a number of the other women are wearing in the photograph. That's a very important part of the suffrage sort of image. And according to this cartoon, right, giving women the right to vote will clean up political corruption and misgovernment. Okay? This is the image that one of the problems with politics is that men are inherently prone to building up old boys networks and corrupt politics and serving their friends only, and women will clean up the dirty pool of politics if the American people would only give them the chance. Now, a lot of things are going on in this period, as you know, but perhaps one of the most significant political developments of the early 20th century, in fact, maybe the most significant political development of the early 20th century in America, was the rise of the national state. Nationalization was occurring everywhere. There were national corporations that dominated the economy, national organizations like the American Medical Association began to establish professional standards, raise incomes, right, raise respect for professions. And even sports, we had the development of the National League in this period, the American League in baseball. Progressives believed that only an energetic national government could establish the social conditions of freedom. Right? Poverty, economic insecurity, and the absence of industrial democracy were national problems that could only be solved nationally, progressives thought. Right? Now, Theodore Roosevelt was the first progressive-era president to address this question. And remember, he'd been vice president under McKinley. He was the youngest president. He was the youngest vice president ever, then became the youngest president ever because McKinley was assassinated. JFK was later the youngest person ever elected president, but Roosevelt was the youngest person ever to hold the office. He was impetuous. He was energetic. He celebrated something called the strenuous life, manly adventure, and daring. And he became a kind of model for the 20th century president, active, continuously involved in domestic and foreign policy, setting the political agenda, making the presidency seem more important or at least more visible than Congress. Roosevelt advanced a program he called the Square Deal, which addressed problems of economic consolidation by distinguishing between basically good and bad corporations, right, giving people a square deal. And soon after taking office, Roosevelt shocked the business world by prosecuting the Northern Securities Company, which was a holding company created by the financier I've talked about before, J.P. Morgan, in order to run three Western railroads that had monopolized rail transportation between the Great Lakes and the Pacific. And in 1904, the Supreme Court handed down an antitrust handed down a decision which gave the antitrust movement a significant victory by ordering that Northern Securities be dissolved and returned to smaller companies. That was trust busting at the highest level. When the president gets involved, when the Supreme Court gets involved, that's really as high as it can go. Roosevelt also believed that the president should help settle labor disputes. The presidency was sort of a neutral third party, wouldn't act simply in favor of business, as most previous presidents had. In 1902, a strike paralyzed the coal industry. Roosevelt brought union leaders and managers to the White House and settled the strike by appointing a commission to look into it. Now, he was reelected in 1904, and he advocated more direct economic regulations, including reinforcing the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC. This is a very, very powerful and important element of the federal government then and now. Those powers had been restricted by the Supreme Court, but Roosevelt restored them in various ways. And in 1906, by 1906, I should say, public opinion really kind of shifted in support of Roosevelt. All right. And Congress, in reaction to this, passed the Hepburn Act, which gave the ICC the power to set railroad rates. Remember, that was the important thing. The different rates between different states sometimes changed, and that was seen as a very backward way of doing things. And this was an important step in giving the federal government some sort of regulatory power on national industries. Okay. Now, lots of businessmen supported the creation of new federal agencies to improve consumer product safety, for instance, but they were also alarmed by Roosevelt's call for federal inheritance tax, for instance, and income tax, and interstate business regulations. So don't get the idea that everybody's on board with this, because they certainly aren't. Almost all things that happen, that pass in the United States pass, with 51 or 52 or 55% approval. It's very rare to get much more than that. So these things were contested all the time. And here is Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, speaking to the crowd in 1902. This is one of his very active, his very engaged speech, very robust, right? Always gave sort of booming speeches. Here is a cartoon, right? Putting the screws on him. This is a 1904 cartoon, I think from Puck. I can't remember where I got it. I shouldn't be so sloppy about that. But this depicts President Roosevelt squeezing ill-gotten gains out of the trusts, out of the monopolies, who are depicted, of course, as grossly fat and out of control. Well, more or less out of control, growing fat off the American consumer. And this may not be as clear as it should be, but it's a great picture, and that's why I always like to include it. It's Theodore Roosevelt posing with a group of other sort of outdoorsy men in a grove of giant sequoia trees in California in 1903. Okay. And one of the things that Roosevelt did was to have a call. He called on Americans to protect these, quote, monuments of beauty, monuments of nature, right? Teddy Roosevelt was one of the early pioneers of the sort of conservation movement, the natural movement, and what we now call the environmentalist movement, right? Didn't want trees like this cut down for lumber. The trees that had lasted that long or had grown to such magnificence should be regarded as magnificent monuments of natural and, more importantly, national beauty. Roosevelt really argued that these things were American treasures, just like mountains were, and should be preserved. Now, Roosevelt's successor to run for president in 1908 was William Howard Taft. Do you remember Taft? We saw a picture of him as governor of the Philippines, sitting on that water buffalo. Before that, he was a federal judge in Ohio. And Taft defeated William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan had ran for presidency a third time unsuccessfully in 1908. Now, Taft was a progressive in that he believed that government should go beyond laissez-faire principles of the 19th century, and he pursued antitrust policies much more aggressively than even had Roosevelt. In 1911, for instance, he convinced the Supreme Court to declare John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act and ordered its breakup into separate companies. Now, this case, along with a similar prosecution of the American Tobacco Corporation, which was also a big monopoly, again, they allowed the government to distinguish between what it saw as good companies, right, who were were in on the competition, accepting of the competition paradigm, and bad companies that tried to stifle competition by monopolizing. Okay. Taft also supported the 16th Amendment, which authorized Congress to establish a graduated national income tax. And this gave the national government a more reliable and flexible source of revenue than the tariff. But despite sort of his progressive policies, Taft tended to ally himself with the more conservative wing of the Republican Party. And in a dispute in 1910 with reform-minded officials within his administration, that dispute alienated progressives. Okay, a man named Richard Ballinger, the Secretary of the Interior, decided to return some of Roosevelt's claimed land back to the public domain, and another member of the administration, Guilford Pinchot, accused Ballinger of colluding with business interests and forsaking progressive environmental goals. Okay, so Taft fires Pinchot, and the breach with Party Progressive became too deep to repair. So lo and behold, 1912, Teddy Roosevelt comes charging back on the scene, challenges Taft for the Republican nomination, which doesn't work, and he launches something called the New and Independent Progressive Party. So you can't get more progressive era politics progressive than calling your new party the Progressive Party. Okay, so this Teddy Roosevelt in 1912. And the election of 1912 is one of the most interesting in American history. Okay? And what you see there is the different tendencies in progressive thought. Right? These are expressed in the 1912 presidential campaign. You had a four-way contest. Taft, Republican; Roosevelt, progressive; Woodrow Wilson, Democratic candidate, had been governor of New Jersey; and the socialist Eugene Debs. Now remember, it's a four-way debate, but really the two biggies, I'll explain that in a minute, turn out to be Roosevelt and Wilson. Each of these people take a different position in what became a national debate on the relationship between politics and economics, political and economic freedom during this age of big business. Okay? Taft, who is the most conservative, argued that economic individualism could still be the basis of society if business and government worked together to solve social ills. Now, Eugene Debs stood on the opposite end of the political spectrum from Taft, right? He was, and although most Americans did not support his socialist revolutionary goals, their proposals for public ownership of railroads and banks, unemployment insurance, and laws limited working hours and setting a minimum wage were actually very typical of the progressive era, right? But again, like I said, it was this fight between Roosevelt and Wilson over the federal government's role in the economy that really captivated most voters in 1912. Now, they both believed government was necessary to preserve individual freedom, but they disagreed about the dangers of increasing government power. Wilson believed in states' rights and in laissez-faire. He was progressive in his policies when he'd been New Jersey's governor, and he helped, for instance, create workers' compensation and state regulation of utilities and railroads. He'd been influenced by Louis Brandeis, and Wilson argued that government had to be independent of big business and restore market competition without creating big government. So his program, which called The New Freedom, involved strengthening antitrust, again, that's anti-monopoly policies, protecting workers' rights to organize unions, encouraging small business. Wilson, you see, hoped to create the conditions for real economic competition without increasing government regulation of the economy. Now, to Roosevelt and his supporters, Wilson's program was outdated. It focused on small business and it ignored the inevitable economic concentration and the interests of professionals, consumers, and labor. Right? Wilson's critics thought he was hearkening back to, the early 19th centuries of small businesses, merchants, and things like that. Roosevelt said that that time has long passed. So his program, Roosevelt's program, was called the New Nationalism. It accepted bigness, for lack of a better word, and the need for strong government to regulate and check the abuses of bigness, the abuses of big business, even the abuses of big government when it was out of control. So Roosevelt proposed actually heavy personal and corporate taxes and federal regulation of industries such as rail industry, mining industry, oil industry. His Progressive Party adopted a platform with many other progressive reforms, such as women's suffrage, an 8-hour day, and a living wage for workers. Okay. He also supported a national system of social insurance, which would cover medical care, unemployment, and old age. Okay. This program, this Theodore Roosevelt program, contained much of the agenda that came to define liberalism in the 20th century. Okay. Now, as a redefinition of what it meant to be an American, united many strands of progressive era thought, this election of 1912 sort of forced the issue about which of those strands people were going to choose. Okay. Roosevelt's New Nationalism was one example. Well, New Nationalism was one example. Roosevelt wanted immigrants to Americanize rather than retaining cultures and customs from the countries of their origin. He also believed that fitness for citizenship, or lack thereof, was inborn, and it was related to past historical experience. To Roosevelt, only persons with the capacity for self-control, which for him and his progressive his progressive party meant mainly white people, only those people were capable of participating in democracy. Roosevelt argued that the government should provide for the well-being of its people to make them better citizens, while retaining the view that only persons with the right kind of character, and he actually says that, the right kind of character, that's a quote, were really qualified for citizenship. So Roosevelt's concept of Americanism, although closed to blacks, closed to Asian Americans, was open to more people than the outlook of contemporaries who also excluded the new immigrants. Okay, the idea was that you could attain Americanism, you could attain self-control, you could attain the right kind of character. Okay, but the coercive potential of this way of thinking became starkly evident a few years later when the United States entered World War II and the government demanded absolute loyalty of all Americans and the immediate assimilation of immigrants. And we'll see how that plays out in our next group of lectures. Okay, this map shows you the presidential election of 1912. You see, of course, Wilson wins. He wins fairly handily. And the other side, the progressive side, well, what had been the Republican progressive side was split between Roosevelt and Taft. Debs gets less than 1 million votes. Wilson wins largely by a landslide. Okay, even if you combine the Roosevelt and Taft numbers, they would not. Well, yes, I guess if you combine the Roosevelt and Taft numbers, they would have been enough to overcome Wilson. But that was mainly the key to Wilson's victory, right? By the way, here's a picture of Eugene Debs, Socialist Party candidate, speaking in Chicago during the 1912 presidential campaign. Again, Debs, like Teddy Roosevelt, very active, dynamic, booming voice speaker. Okay. Now, let me talk a little bit about Wilson's first term. Okay. So the split in the Republican Party gives Wilson this resounding victory. Roosevelt comes in second. This embarrasses Taft. And Wilson became a strong and effective president. He regularly dealt with Congress regarding legislation. He was the first president to hold regular press conferences, something that for some reason JFK gets the credit for, but this had been going on for a long time. He was also the first president to deliver messages personally to Congress. Remember when I mentioned the suffragists showing up in white in 2019 for the State of the Union address? And the State of the Union address is an annual thing. The president shows up to Congress and gives a State of the Union. Well, that's required by the Constitution, but it's not required that the president actually come and give a speech. For the entirety of the country's history, the president would send Congress a a letter, basically, a document stating the state of the union. It didn't have to be an actual speech. The other thing is Democrats also control Congress. So Wilson pushed to implement his progressive vision. He passed the Underwood tariff, which reduced duties on imports, but made up for them by a graduated income tax on the wealthy. Passed the Clayton Act of 1914, which exempted, well, I should say Congress passed the Clayton Act of 1914, which exempted unions from antitrust laws and barred courts from issuing injunctions that limited workers' rights to strike. And other laws outlawed child labor, limiting work in railroads to 8 hours per day, gave credit to farmers who stored their crops in government warehouses, and on and on and on and on and on. Wilson is greatly helped by the fact that he has this big Democratic majority. So some of Wilson's policies seemed more in line with Roosevelt's new nationalism than his own, that is, Wilson's own new freedom agenda of 1912. And gradually, while he was in office, he abandoned antitrust for more government economic regulation. Okay. Wilson pushed Congress to create the Federal Reserve System in 1913, which gave government-regulated banks the ability to issue currency. He helped failing banks and helped influence interest rates. And in 1914, at Wilson's urging, Congress created the Federal Trade Commission, and that was tasked with investigating and prosecuting unfair business activity, such as price fixing and monopoly. Okay. Now, by 1916, Progressive era efforts had vastly increased the powers of the national state. Okay. Government had established rules for labor relations, for business behavior, for financial policy. It protected citizens from market abuses, acted as a broker among the groups whose conflicts threatened to destroy social harmony. Okay, so if you will, this is the triumph of progressivism before the First World War. It gets to this point, right, where it's established all of these things and established them through Wilson and Congress's power base, essentially. And we'll talk more about that after we, partly during their time discussing World War II, but partly about that during the discussion of World War I, but more especially about that when we talk about the 1920s.